Albert is one of the venture capitalists that I admire the most. I'm not just saying that because he's speaking. I'm saying it because I invited him to speak. And I think that what he put together for his short ebook, The World After Capital, could not possibly be more timely. He's been prescient in all things Web3. Union Square, obviously way ahead of the curve with respect to crypto, being one of the first credible investors in the industry in Coinbase. And I can give them a little bit of partial indirect credit for helping me get into the industry as well, because Fred Wilson and the team at USV took the career risk out of crypto in 2013 when they invested in Coinbase. And I'm appreciative of that and appreciative from a financial standpoint, because obviously it was a good idea for me to buy Bitcoin on Coinbase in mid 2013. Albert, welcome. For starters, where are you right now? Are you out of the thick of things and out of harm's way?
Yeah, we're upstate New York at the moment. Very much fortunate to have, during the COVID crisis, been able to get away.
Excellent. I want to kick off by just doing a quick read from the last paragraph in your intro, which I was rereading today as we thought about this interview. The world after capital argues for increased freedoms rooted in humanism as the way to transition from the industrial age to the knowledge age. I'm profoundly optimistic about the ultimate potential for human progress. I am, however, pessimistic about how we'll get there. We seem intent on clinging to the industrial age at all costs, increasing the likelihood of violent change. My hope then is that in writing World After Capital, I can help in some small way to move us forward peacefully. That resonated a few months ago when we were thinking about putting together this agenda, which is why I wanted to close this governance session with this particular conversation. It is especially timely and relevant right now, given everything that's going on post-coronavirus, and now with the economic correction and all of the social unrest. So I want to give you the chance to elaborate on the thesis behind World After Capital and how you thought about the Web3 ecosystem, Bitcoin, the concept of exit and self-sovereign individuals, and how, if at all, that thesis has changed or sped up in light of everything that's happened so far in 2020.
Well, it's a very broad question. I mean, I think a good starting point maybe is to just acknowledge that I think what we're seeing at the moment, is what you get when you have a huge amount of pent-up frustration of people who haven't been heard for a very long time, and I think it's also clear that we are reaching this sort of end phase or transitional phase of the industrial age, where we have the kind of income and wealth inequality that exceeds what we had, let's say, in the 1920s, and where we have this tension between many different objectives that we're all trying to achieve at the same time. And then we have entire groups of, the population here, Black Americans who have been denied opportunities and who have been at the sort of receiving end of police brutality for a long time. And now that people are out protesting, we see that, we have built up policing, and I live in New York City normally. We've built up policing in big cities, especially post 9/11, to be highly militarized. And so this is a very volatile combination to have huge amount of progress, but to have that progress, the benefits of that progress, highly concentrated among some people, and to have a highly militarized police at the same time is not a great setup. So with that sort of said, I think the key thesis of the book is this idea. It's this idea that different human ages have had different scarcities. The forager age had food as its scarcity, the agrarian age had land as its scarcity, the industrial age had capital as its scarcity, by which I mean physical capital. And now we have this new stage, and the scarcity, I believe that the binding scarcity these days is attention. And we're seeing, for example, in the current media environment, we're seeing the central role of attention and people vying for it.
I think that jives well with the opening remarks that we had yesterday from Balaji. He kind of thought about his view of the universe. Every company, every person being a media company these days, and basically creativity, which is a large part of the knowledge economy, becoming not just a hobby, but maybe more of a duty to opine when you are a subject matter expert in certain areas. And that transition has been kind of multi-decade, and going from traditional media where there's a trusted third party, that's gone out the window with the concept of citizen journalists and social media, but that's very noisy. And now you're starting to get to what I think one of the core things that you talked about in World After Capital. How do you curate attention and truly unlock value so that we're not so overly inundated with crappy information, right? Or worse, toxic and actively malicious information that's being used to hijack your attention and taken to the extreme brainwash.
Well, I think that's sort of the important starting point, right? So is when I say capital is no longer the binding constraint, I don't mean to suggest that capital is abundant. In the book, I make a very clear distinction between things that are scarce, which means they are severely limiting our progress, and they're kind of the thing that defines how society, what the boundaries in society are. Then there's sufficient, which is it's not the binding constraint, and then there's abundant. And so we're a long way from capital being abundant. Why do I say that attention is scarce? It's scarce because there are crucial things that we're not paying enough attention to. What are some examples of this? So at the individual level, people aren't paying enough attention to what their purpose in life is. And so that's why a lot of people find themselves with midlife crises. That's a lot of people who find themselves with a search for meaning, that they follow easy answers as opposed to sort of trying to really spend the time and attention to figure out what's right for them. But at the sort of collective, at the societal level, we've clearly not paid enough attention to infectious disease, right? And we haven't paid enough attention, let's say specifically to coronaviruses, even though we had two big warnings. We had SARS 2 decades ago, we had MERS 1 decade ago. So it's not like we haven't had warnings, and we still didn't spend enough attention on it. Mm-hmm. Climate crisis is another huge example. I think of an area that we're not paying nearly enough attention to. And why is that? It is because so much of our attention is getting hijacked by systems like Twitter and like Facebook, like YouTube, systems that are explicitly designed to grab as much of our attention as possible because their model is to take some sliver of that attention and resell it. I mean, that is the fundamental nature of advertising, right? And so if you have an advertising-based business model, you will tweak your algorithms, whether maliciously or just by following your optimization function. You will tweak your algorithms towards hogging human attention. I always like to give this example. YouTube is not going to suddenly insert something into your stream that says, and now I'm going to teach you, the actual intricacies of the Bitcoin protocol. I'm going to walk you through how hashing works. I mean, that's not going to randomly make it, because that's going to require you to pay attention and to sort of switch your system from the kind of responsive system, the sort of, all the heuristics that our brain engages so easily and rapidly. It requires you to switch from that to, using the rational parts of your brain, which require effort. And so that's not in YouTube's interest to do that.
There's a lot of truth to this, and I think you can look at advertising as maybe a good starting point for how do we rewire people's brains, and crypto, I think, is unique in this regard. Any good advertiser will tell you the three things sell: fear, sex, and greed. I don't know that we're ever going to figure out. I mean, it's short of a Billy Madison montage where you're trying to force feed people and reward them with some really weird videos to get them to learn more actively. I think your two options right now are either fear or greed, and the macro environment is kind of taking care of the fear factor with respect to pushing the issue and helping people understand that this is not just a fringe issue or an emerging markets issue, but this is kind of here and now, even in a country like the US. But in addition to that, crypto has solved for the greed issue in terms of how it rethinks about incentive structures. The billion-dollar question, trillion-dollar question, though, is how far along do you think these incentive structures are for things like data privacy and IP rights and some of the other solutions that you write about as the features that we need to implement if we're going to have a smooth transition from the industrial age to the knowledge age and overcome some of these scarcity issues?
Yeah, so I guess attention is a tricky thing, and maybe I should spend 1 second sort of why do I keep saying attention and not, let's say, time. Like attention is to time, the way velocity is to speed. So speed is you're going at some speed, velocity says which direction are you going in,
Mm-hmm.
And so time is sort of, yes, we all had 24 hours yesterday. Attention is what we directed our brain towards in those 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think that there are any easy answers how to free up people's attention to focus on the difficult problems of, and not just problems, but also opportunities in the world, right? In the book, I really talk about 3 separate aspects to this, and I call them economic freedom, informational freedom, and psychological freedom. So, crypto.
You can tell Albert's German.
Yeah. And crypto plays a role, I think, in at least 2 out of those 3, a potential role. So let me just briefly talk about what they are, and then we can talk a little bit about how crypto plays into this. So economic freedom for me is some form of universal basic income. And there's a number of crypto projects that are aimed at that. Then informational freedom is, how much control do we have over the systems that are out there? That is, do we interact with systems like social systems that are fundamentally programmable, or are we interacting with systems that where we are reduced to, using our thumbs to interact with them, right? And right now, the vast bulk of things we interact with, even on the supercomputers that we all carry around, we're like reduced to using our thumbs, and they're not programmable. And one of the things that's amazing about crypto is that basically by design, everything is programmable. But then there's also this third freedom, which I call psychological freedom. And that doesn't require any technology at all. That requires just what you have already in your head, your brain. And that's just a realization that, our brain didn't evolve in this information environment. It evolved in an environment where, when you saw a cat, there was an actual cat. And now I can show you, an endless feed of cats, including crypto cats, I suppose. So we all need to take that step to free up our own attention. And that involves both like simple hacks, like my phone's always on D&D. It doesn't even light up the screen. The only thing that makes my phone do anything is when one of my immediate family members calls or texts me. Mm-hmm. Everything else leaves my phone still, right? So I decide when I pick up my phone, not my phone decides when I pick up my phone. That's just one simple example, but there's also, I know it's sort of a cliche term, but there's also this concept of mindfulness. And, I think each one of us needs to develop a practice. I don't care whether you meditate or run or, whatever it is, but whatever works for you is important. And so I do think that getting back on charge of attention starts with ourselves, with steps we can take. And then I think there's interesting things we can do in crypto land. And then I think there are things that we have to do in the non-crypto regulatory land in order for the things that we're building in the decentralized world to be able to really take off.
That last one strikes me as the hardest. UBI is more passive, right? That's a policy decision. It's something that needs to be implemented. We need to think about how those incentive structures could work to free people up to change jobs or make that transition more seamless. The second one seems like a problem that major tech companies should be able to solve. In terms of data privacy and intellectual property rights.
Well, except that they're not going to solve it, right? I mean, their interest isn't in solving it.
Not the existing incumbents, right?
Well,
but maybe new disruptors.
And I guess my point is that new disruptors, in a world where network effects are so powerful, I really think we who work on crypto, many people here in the audience, it's all they do at USV. It's some of what we do, but anybody who's got an interest in crypto, I think, has to face the reality that the network effects that exist in a Facebook and in a Twitter are formidable, and that it is unlikely that crypto decentralized alternatives to these systems will become truly large and mainstream unless the existing incumbents are being more strictly regulated. And I think that's the history of innovation in computers. Is people always say, "Oh, it's platform disruption that lands in the shift," but it's always been the combination of platform disruption and the regulation of the incumbents. It's just a rewriting of history to claim that it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
It was Microsoft that was hobbled by the proper regulation and by consent decrees that opened the room for other people to compete. It was IBM that had to face consent decrees. So it was AT&T that faced them. Like the idea that it was just somehow this technology that we created and it made the incumbents just, irrelevant, I just think is not it's ahistorical.
Well, you need a well-functioning government to put some type of impedance to any monopoly platform if you are going to open the door there. And I could argue that we might be seeing that now. Right?
Well, except that I think governments at the moment are thinking about the wrong kind of impedance because they're thinking about industrial age impedance measures. And I just think we need measures that are native to the digital age. And in my mind, the thing that's native to the digital age is APIs. So one of the things I write about in the book is we should require Facebook and Twitter and Google and Amazon. We should require them to have APIs. We should make them programmable. And I think that would shift a lot of the power back from the center out to the edge of the network. And it would make it so that new entrants, including decentralized new entrants, can be, from an end user perspective, seamlessly integrated with the existing world, as opposed to requiring to make a decision that you're going to go and spend time in a decentralized one and then remember, oh, some of my friends aren't actually here, they're over there. And like putting that cognitive load on the end user when the end user carries a supercomputer around just makes no sense.
What do you think of Twitter's attempt here? When I look at the Blue Sky announcement in December, I think some people might have scoffed at it. I tend to believe Jack and believe that team might be expending some serious effort on decentralizing the back end. At the same time, pushing too hard in that direction is in direct conflict with their responsibilities to shareholders because it could be very disruptive to the core platform itself. Is their approach the right one? Or is that the one that strikes you as having the most promise, where you open source the back end and then allow for competition on the front end interfaces and clients?
I'm not honestly super bullish on waiting for big corporations to disrupt themselves. I think the combination of new things that other people are building together with some sensible approaches to regulation is what will get the job done. I'm not trying to diminish what Twitter has said here. I just think it has happened, but it's unlikely. I mean, an example of where it happened, ironically, of course, is also, again, IBM, when they basically made the PC an open platform. So it has happened. So I don't want to say there's no historic precedent, and I don't want to say Twitter won't get it done, but it's more on the unlikely side.
Well, Twitter at least is helmed by someone who seems to be strikingly self-aware, and so let's talk about this third pillar, which I think is the most challenging one, because it's the salvation lives within type of mindset. You can come up with policy to figure out UBI. You can come up with a combination of policy and entrepreneurship with people that have vested interest in getting the calculus right to solve the second bucket. But this third bucket of just psychological freedom, are there any hacks or any nudges that could be done from entrepreneurial folks or from a policy perspective that could help nudge us in that direction? Because you know how hard self-improvement is for most people. I mean, there's multi-billion-dollar industries around diet and exercise and fitness and vitamins and all these aspirational things. But when it comes down to it, most people are always going to reach for the Twinkie, right? So to me, that might be the biggest structural, like, human challenge that we face in terms of getting some of this right.
Excuse me while I grab a Twinkie. You know, I guess I have a lot of thoughts on this. The first is, of course, tech can help, right? I mean, I do think that meditation has become more accessible through apps. There are quite a few of them out there. You know, I definitely think that configuring your tech in the right way is helpful, as I mentioned earlier. But I do think that there is a long, you know, multi-thousand-year history, both in the Eastern and Western tradition, of relatively simple techniques that people can and should learn. And one of the more fascinating things to me is that these aren't widely taught, right? So you can go through all of K-12 and college without, like, you'll have mandatory classes in a lot of things, but strangely, you won't have a, like, here's the actual, like, owner's manual for your brain. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the missing, you know, this whole series of books, the missing manual. Like that should be one of the things that you spend a lot of time on, right? And so I do think, you know, these transitions, the transition out of the industrial age into what in the book I call the knowledge age, they take a long time because all the components of the existing system hang together, mutually reinforce each other, right? The education system that we have today is fundamentally an industrial age system. It's a system that is designed not to foster, but to combat intrinsic motivation and curiosity, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised when we have a system that doesn't teach you about how to operate your brain properly, that suppresses your natural curiosity and your intrinsic motivation, and tries to make you easily like receptive to being a part of the industrial machine. We shouldn't be surprised if we then wind up with a lot of people who are just that. I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
have put them through a system that was specifically designed for that purpose. So I think there's a lot we can do in technology to help deal with that. Because, for example, we can now build systems on which anybody can learn anything, potentially even from a very early age, that can be a real alternative to the existing education and learning system as it exists out in the world. And you know, bringing this back to something you asked earlier about incentives, I do think that you know, we can, in subtle ways, create incentives for people to explore those systems and to get attention drawn into those systems. I am not a fan at all of systems like STEAM.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm not a fan at all of these is because they are too much of the side of sort of extrinsic motivation. You know, it's like, do this and get an immediate extrinsic reward. And I think if we've learned one thing about humans is that they are very susceptible to strong extrinsic rewards, and that those strong extrinsic rewards are exactly the thing that flattens intrinsic motivation. And, you know, I spend a lot of my time with USB portfolio companies on designing, for example, sales compensation schemes. And if anybody who's ever managed salespeople will know, you get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm.
And to the detriment of pretty much everything else, right? And so in any situation where quality is hard to assess, if you provide strong extrinsic motivation, you're going to get a lot of quantity at very
Mm-hmm.
poor quality. And so I think as we think about what are certain decentralized crypto token based systems that provide incentives around learning and the production of knowledge, I think it's very easy to wind up with systems that optimize for quantity as opposed to optimize for quality and for improvement over time.
I'm going to ask one question about your investment theses, but I want to challenge you to make it a lightning round answer because there's a more important topic that I want to wrap up with. And that in and of itself could be a 40-minute conversation, I'm sure. But this thesis world after capital in particular, mixed with everything that's going on so far this year, what are the next dominoes to fall? Because there's this saying in venture, right? If you're early, you're wrong. And a lot of things that felt like they might be a couple of
All right, I guess I think I'm on, so I'm not exactly sure what where Ryan was going with this. The part I got was wait for other dominoes to fall. I think it's extremely difficult to predict how any of this plays itself out because the sort of range of possible outcomes at the moment is so large. And I think where that leads me to is that what we all need to do as individuals is think about our sort of more immediate spheres of influence and what we can do in those. So to give some examples of that, my wife and I are supporting a basic income project in Hudson, which is a local town that we are also building a new learning center in that is also focused on this idea of sort of intrinsic learning. So that's an example of doing something very concrete in a space that we control. I think similarly, if you are building a crypto system, think about the parameters of your specific system. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think in the larger scheme of things, who knows how the November election will turn out? Who knows whether any of these coronavirus vaccines will work or not? And I think there is always a temptation to either try to solve all problems at once, or to just go, it doesn't matter what I do, things are terrible one way or another. And in either of those directions, I think lies either inaction or failure. And the only thing that one can do is sort of control the most local things that one has direct influence over, and to control them in a way where one is thinking about how those fit into a bigger picture. And we have Ryan back.
Excellent. So you caught the gist of my question. We've reached the rolling blackouts phase of 2020, clearly, since Alexa lost power, and I'm in a different state, and I also just did the same. But we're going to work with this internet connection from my phone, thanks to AT&T. Not a sponsor, but they better not crap out. So thank you for picking up the slack. This doesn't happen in live events, right? So that's what makes it exciting.
Yeah, you don't just walk off stage for a few minutes and then come back.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? This is bullshit because I only wanted to give you a minute for your investment thesis, and you ended up getting 3. So I do want to end though with something that I think is important. You were the first person that turned me on to Andrew Yang early on in his primary, and I think it's safe to say that there's a pretty healthy percentage of people in our demographic and our audience in particular that at least Yang's message resonates, even if they're not supporters. I think disproportionately this crowd was more likely to vote or at least appreciate some of his policy provisions. It's impossible to talk about crypto at this stage of the game without talking about the much larger political needs that we have, not just in the US, but abroad. And I think there's, for a very, very long time, been a hesitation from good, smart people to get civically engaged, to get actively engaged in politics, because it just seems like such a corrosive influence on someone to actually go down that rabbit hole and pursue civic duties in general society. And I'll be the first person to admit I might be guilty of this as well, because when I think about my day-to-day work and what gets me out of bed in the morning and has for the last 7 years, it is very much about exit versus fixing some of the underlying problems. It's almost like we need a ripcord, we need a safety chute that we can pull in the event that things go really haywire, which unfortunately they've been going that direction. So my question to you is, how do we balance all the work that we're doing on exit-related technologies with the real need for leadership, not just in the U.S., but internationally, and democracies and countries worldwide, even if they're not technically democracies?
Well, I think that everybody needs to sort of make that choice for themselves. And what I found a useful approach to this is to the extent that you're somebody who's working on exit. I mean, there's this famous framework, voice versus exit from Hirschleifer, right? So then you can use other means of supporting people who are going the voice route. So my wife and I donated to Andrew's campaign, and and we have supported, for instance, Represent.us, which is an organization that's trying to fix how voting works in the U.S. And other aspects of democracy, such as the revolving door between lobbyists and the agencies that regulate the very industries that those lobbyists come from or go back to. So I think that make a personal choice. I don't think there's a right or wrong choice. You can work on a little bit of both, or you can work on just exit, like creating the new alternative systems. So you can just work, but be cognizant that you can also support others who've made an opposite choice, and that you don't need to sort of be like, exit is the only thing where we're going to be seasteading and nothing else matters. Like, don't try to I just think both approaches are legitimate, and both approaches will ultimately have to come together. And so if you've picked one, try to support people in the other.
Final question, because it's relevant directly to you, maybe some of your colleagues. Mark Cuban, I think, seriously excited people when he flirted with the idea that he might run as an independent candidate. People have circulated names like Chamath and other Silicon Valley leaders. At what point do more investors, more thoughtful entrepreneurs have a responsibility? You say make your own decision, but at what point do you feel they have a responsibility to actively either run for office or get in?
Well, I believe I would start maybe at a slightly different end of this, which is I do think we all have a responsibility not to let terrible things just pass, right? I think we all have a responsibility that when we have people in power who are saying, let's turn the military against the citizenry, that we say, no, that is not how it works, and we're not going to be standing for it. I think that is the starting point. I think the hurdle is actually quite low. The hurdle isn't go run. The hurdle is just don't go along with all the bullshit that's happening.
Amen. Albert, it's always a pleasure. I hope people enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and hope you're staying safe, and we'll do this again soon.
My pleasure, Ryan. Bye-bye.